When the lawyer told me my father left me nothing, I didn't cry. I remember just sitting there, hands folded in my lap, staring at the neat stack of papers that declared my absence from his will. He had left everything, the house, the land, the savings, to my 2 brothers. Not a single mention of me. Not a line, not even a token. The man who taught me to read under the flicker of a kerosene lamp had, according to that document, decided I was worth nothing at all. My brothers avoided my eyes that day. Robert busied himself with his pen, tapping it against the table. Matthew kept staring out the window, muttering something about Dad's decision, not ours. I just nodded, numb. It's strange, the way grief changes shape. I had cried for my father's death, but this betrayal felt colder, quieter. It wasn't a wound that bled. It was one that froze. I left the office with the paper still echoing in my head. Disinherited. It's such an old-fashioned word. It sounds biblical, like something done for moral failure, the punishment of a prodigal daughter. But I hadn't done anything. At least, not that I knew of. The months after his funeral were heavy. The house we grew up in, the old stone farmhouse with ivy crawling up the walls, now belonged to my brothers. They divided it quickly. Robert kept the land, Matthew took the savings and the vehicles. They said I could take whatever sentimental things I wanted if it helps you move on. I took an old photograph of Dad fixing the fence, a chipped mug he used for his morning coffee, and the radio that still smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. Then I walked out, promising myself never to set foot in that house again. Years passed. I built my life quietly. I worked as an accountant, lived in a small apartment in the city, married briefly, and divorced quietly. People often said I was steady, the sort of woman who didn't make trouble, who didn't raise her voice. They didn't know that my silence wasn't calmness. It was containment. It wasn't until 12 years later, after Robert's sudden death, that I found myself back on that old property again. I hadn't planned to go inside the house. But when Matthew called to say they were finally selling it, something inside me stirred. Not resentment, curiosity. A need to stand inside those walls one more time before strangers claimed them. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The windows were clouded with dust, the porch sagged slightly, and the smell, that unmistakable mix of wood polish and thyme, hit me the moment I stepped in. Matthew was already there, sorting boxes in the living room. He looked up, startled. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. "I just wanted to see it once more," I replied. He nodded and went back to packing. We worked in silence for a while. He sorted, I wandered. The rooms echoed with faint ghosts, laughter over Sunday dinners, Dad whistling as he made coffee, the hum of his favorite radio program. It wasn't nostalgia that filled me. It was absence. In the hallway, I noticed the pull cord to the attic, the same one I'd been scared of as a child. Dad used to keep old records up there, tools, broken lamps, things too good to throw out but too useless to keep. Without thinking, I pulled the cord. Dust rained down, and the wooden ladder creaked open like it hadn't moved in years. Matthew frowned. "You don't have to go up there, you know. We already cleared most of it." "I just want to look," I said quietly. The air was thick and dry. Each step creaked beneath my feet. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, catching particles of dust like tiny gold sparks. Boxes were stacked unevenly, some marked Christmas, others tools, one labeled simply old papers. It smelled of oil and cedar and thyme. I crouched down and opened the old papers box. Inside were yellowed envelopes, property receipts, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. Most were familiar, tax slips, land agreements, all signed neatly by my father's steady hand. Then, at the very bottom, something odd caught my eye. A thick envelope sealed with red wax. It had my father's handwriting. And across the front, in his neat cursive, were the words, "To be read only by Eleanor." My name. My hands began to tremble. I sat down on an old wooden chest, barely breathing. The seal cracked easily, too easily, as if waiting to be broken. Inside was a folded document. The first line made my vision blur. "This is the last will and testament of Thomas H. Clarke." It was his original will, dated 6 months before his death. My name was there. Clear, unambiguous. I was listed as the primary heir to the property, the savings, and the land. Everything that had been taken from me. At the bottom, his signature unmistakable, the same slanted T and looped H he'd used on every form since forever. And beside it, the notary's stamp. My heart thudded. I flipped through the pages, reading and rereading, as if disbelief could undo ink. He had never disowned me. They had. I climbed down the attic ladder with shaking legs, the paper clutched in my hand. Matthew was still in the living room, taping up boxes. "Matt," I said quietly. He turned, still distracted. "What's up?" I held up the document. "This. Explain this." He froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his eyes darted to the envelope, then to my face. Where did you find that?" "In the attic. It has Dad's handwriting. His signature. It's notarized." He rubbed his jaw, avoiding my gaze. "That's an old draft. He changed it later." "No," I said. "He didn't. This is dated 6 months before he died. You told me he rewrote it a year before. That means you lied." He sighed heavily. "Eleanor, listen, Dad wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Robert handled all the paperwork. He said." "He said what?" "That you didn't need the house. You were living in the city, you had a good job. Dad just wanted things to be simple." I stared at him. "Simple," I repeated, my voice shaking. "You mean convenient. For you. Don't make this ugly," he snapped suddenly. "It's been years. You've done fine without it. That doesn't make it right." He stood there, jaw tight, eyes flashing something between guilt and anger. "You can't just show up now and reopen old wounds." "They're not old to me," I whispered. "They never healed." He turned away, muttering something under his breath, then stormed out to the porch. I stood there alone, the will trembling in my hand. For a moment, I thought I might faint. But then, somewhere beneath the shaking, a strange calm rose up. A kind of cold, quiet certainty. I folded the document carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into my bag. For 12 years, I had lived under a lie. Now, I was going to make it right. That night, I stayed at a small inn just outside town. I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, filled with ghosts. I kept thinking about my father, his voice, his way of pausing before speaking, as if measuring every word. He wasn't perfect. He was strict, sometimes distant. But he was fair. Always fair. He used to tell me, "Eleanor, fairness isn't about who wins. It's about who tells the truth." And somewhere along the way, that truth had been buried. Literally. I thought of all the times I'd doubted myself, wondered if I'd done something to deserve being cut out. All the quiet humiliation, the whispered pity from extended family. All the years I'd accepted being invisible. Not anymore. The next morning, I went back to the lawyer, the same man who'd handled the estate all those years ago. He looked older now, his hair mostly white, glasses thicker. When I placed the envelope on his desk, he frowned. "What's this?" "My father's original will." He opened it slowly, adjusting his glasses. As he read, his expression shifted, curiosity to confusion, confusion to disbelief. This is authentic," he murmured. "It's notarized, properly dated. Eleanor, where did you find this?" "In the attic. Hidden." He leaned back, exhaling. "Your brothers told me he revoked the earlier version. They brought a new will unsigned, actually, and claimed he wanted to make adjustments but never got to it before he passed." "So you went with their version?" He looked embarrassed. At the time, there was no reason to doubt them. They were persuasive. "Persuasive," I repeated. "That's one word for it." He cleared his throat. "Eleanor, with this document, You may have grounds to reopen the estate. I stared at him. After 12 years. It's rare, but not impossible. Especially with clear evidence of concealment. You'd need to file a petition for fraudulent suppression of testamentary documents. The words sounded clinical, cold, but I felt heat rise in my chest. Fraudulent suppression. Yes. That's exactly what it was. He looked at me over his glasses. Are you prepared for what this means? It could get ugly. Family cases like this, they often do. I thought for a moment. Then I said, quietly but firmly, I've already lived through ugly. I can live through truth. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in the city, the will spread out before me. I traced my father's signature with my fingertip. And I promised him out loud. I will put your name back where it belongs. And mine, too. In the weeks that followed, I returned to work as if nothing had changed. On the outside, my life looked the same grey office walls, the same clacking keyboards, the same polite nods from co-workers who knew me only as the quiet one in accounting. But something inside me had shifted. For 12 years, I'd lived a muted version of myself, buried under doubt and obedience. Now, every number I typed, every ledger I balanced, reminded me of the one ledger that had never been balanced, my father's will. After Dad's death, I built my world around routines. It was the only way I knew how to survive betrayal without letting it show. I worked long hours, kept to myself, lived simply. My apartment was neat, almost too neat, everything folded, stacked, aligned. It gave me the illusion of control. I didn't marry again after the divorce. When people asked why, I'd smile and say, I'm content. But the truth was simpler. I didn't trust easily anymore. When your own blood rewrites your name out of existence, it stains how you see promises. My brothers rarely contacted me after the will was read. We exchanged obligatory holiday texts, nothing more. Robert had a family of his own, Matthew never married. They both stayed in the town, built their lives on the foundation of what they'd taken. And I let them, because I thought fighting it would make me small. But now, as I stared at my father's real will lying on my kitchen table, I realized silence doesn't make you graceful. It makes you complicit. Ruth was my closest friend, though she always said we were more like sisters. She lived 2 blocks away in an apartment filled with plants and old books. When I showed her the will, she leaned back, eyes wide. My God, she whispered. You mean to tell me they lied about your inheritance for over a decade? I nodded. She ran a hand through her curls, pacing. Eleanor, that's criminal. You can't just sit on this. I'm not, I said quietly. I've already spoken to a lawyer. She looked at me then, really looked, and her expression softened. This isn't just about the money, is it? No, I said, my throat tightening. It's about the truth. My father didn't abandon me. They made me believe he did. Her words warmed something inside me I hadn't realized was still cold. Before the hearing, my lawyer hired a forensic document examiner to authenticate the will. Watching him work was like watching science resurrect truth. He compared the ink flow, pressure, and pen angle. This is unquestionably your father's handwriting, he confirmed. And the date checks out. Then he held up a magnified image of the signature. Notice this loop in the H, he said. He only does that when he's calm. The later samples from the so-called new draft are shakier, signs of someone copying or forging. I felt my stomach twist. So the new draft was probably traced, he finished. The night before the preliminary hearing, Matthew showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't open the door. When I did, he stood there looking thinner, older, his confidence dimmed. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I hesitated, then nodded. He stepped inside, glancing around as if expecting judgment to be written on my walls. I didn't come to fight, he said. I just need you to understand Robert was the one who wanted this. I went along with it. He said you'd move on, that it'd be easier that way. Easier for who? I asked. For everyone, he said, voice trembling. You were always different. You asked too many questions. He said you'd complicate things. Complicate what? The transfer of land, he admitted. There was debt, Eleanor. The farm wasn't as stable as you thought. Robert wanted to sell part of it, but Dad refused. If you inherited, it would have stopped him. He needed your share to make the deal go through. My chest tightened. So he erased me. Matthew's eyes filled with tears. I let him. I told myself you didn't care about the land. That you had your life in the city. But when I saw you today, with that will in your hand, I realized what we did. I looked at him for a long moment. You didn't just take land, Matthew. You took peace. My peace. He wiped his face. I'm sorry. I wanted to believe him. Maybe part of me did. But apologies don't rewrite history, they just acknowledge it. Still, I said quietly, then tell the court the truth. He nodded slowly. I will. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and varnish. I sat at one table with Mr. Harding, my hands clasped tightly around the edge. Across from me sat Matthew, pale, restless, avoiding my eyes. The judge entered, solemn and calm. Ms. Clarke, he began, you claim your father's original will was suppressed by your brothers following his death. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you have presented this document as evidence? Yes. The judge turned to Matthew. Mr. Clarke. He hesitated, then sighed. Your Honor, she's telling the truth. My brother and I withheld the original. I'm sorry. Gasps rippled through the small gallery. The judge's expression hardened. Then this court will move to revalidate the original testament. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 12 years, I felt like I could breathe. The hearing ended before noon, but I sat in my car for nearly an hour afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, unable to start the engine. It wasn't victory I felt, not yet. It was the strange weight of truth, heavy and light all at once. For 12 years, I'd carried a wound no one could see. Now, the bandage had been torn off, and the air stung. When I finally drove away, the courthouse shrank behind me, its white columns glowing in the afternoon sun. The same town that once looked through me now looked at me differently. People who used to cross the street when they saw me in the market were suddenly curious again. I could almost feel the whispers moving ahead of me. She found the will. She took them to court. She won. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt exposed. That evening, I went back to my apartment and made tea. The kettle whistled louder than usual, as if mimicking my pulse. I sat at the table, staring at the folded court document confirming that the estate would be reopened and my father's original will reinstated. The official paper looked sterile, lifeless, so unlike the man it spoke for. I pulled his letter out of the envelope again and read his handwriting. It wasn't just ink, it was his voice. Calm. Firm. Just like him. He'd wanted to protect me. And they'd hidden that. I whispered into the quiet room, I found you, Dad. Outside, the city hummed like it always did, taxis, sirens, conversations drifting from balconies. But for once, I wasn't lost in it. Over the next few days, calls began to come in. Some from distant relatives, some from people I hadn't spoken to since the funeral. Everyone had an opinion, some congratulated me, others accused me of tearing the family apart. One aunt even said, "Why drag your brothers through the mud? Your father wouldn't have wanted this." I almost laughed. If only she knew how hard he tried to keep this family honest. I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that truth doesn't need shouting, it needs standing. A week later, I received an unexpected visit. It was Clara, Robert's widow. She looked exhausted, dressed in muted colors, her eyes carrying the weight of too many unspoken things. I invited her in. She sat down, clutching a folder. "I don't know where to start," she said softly. "Robert, he wasn't a bad man, Eleanor. But he was proud. Too proud to admit mistakes. When your father died, he panicked. The farm was drowning in debt, and the only way to keep it from being repossessed was to sell part of the land quickly. He told Matthew that if your name stayed on the will, the sale would take months. He said he'd make it right later. I stayed silent, letting her speak. But later never came, she continued. He convinced himself it was justified that you didn't want the farm, that you'd moved on. And when he saw you at the reading, so calm, he thought you already knew. I looked at her then. He thought my silence meant permission. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes. We sat quietly for a while. The city noises felt distant. She opened the folder. Inside were old bank slips, land sale records, all marked in Robert's handwriting. I kept these, she said. I thought one day you might need to see them. They show the sale, the debts, and the repayment he never made. Her voice broke. He was wrong, Eleanor. But he died still believing he'd done what was necessary. I closed the folder gently. Necessary isn't the same as right. She nodded. No. It never is. When she left, I stood by the window and watched her disappear into the night. A strange tenderness settled in my chest, pity, maybe, but also relief. Finally, I understood the shape of what had been done to me. It wasn't just theft. It was fear, pride, and silence all tangled together. The following week, I returned to the farmhouse with the court's authorization to take possession of my father's share. The house looked the same, time-worn and defiant. Dust motes shimmered in the doorway as I pushed it open. Every corner of that place held echoes. The floorboards creaked like old memories. The clock on the mantel was still stopped at 6:42, the moment the power had gone out on the night of his stroke. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the old furniture, the chipped frame of his reading chair. I found myself whispering apologies to him, to myself, to all the years lost to misunderstanding. Upstairs, the attic door still hung open from the day I found the will. The air up there was cooler now, lighter somehow. I stood at the top of the ladder and whispered, I found what you left me, Dad. Not just the house, the truth. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, an old wooden box under the eaves I hadn't noticed before. It was small, painted green, the paint flaking like aged moss. I knelt and pried it open. Inside were letters tied with a thin ribbon. Each was addressed to me. I sat right there on the attic floor, knees tucked under me, and began to read. The first one was dated 3 months before he passed. Ellie. I know we haven't always agreed. You were born with a will of your own, just like your mother. I'm proud of that. Don't let anyone make you small to keep peace. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong with how things were left. But know this, everything I built with you in mind. The rest is just paper. Love. Dad. My breath caught. I read the next one. Ellie. Don't let bitterness take root. It grows fast, and it'll eat what's good in you. If the truth ever comes to light, stand tall, but don't lose your softness. It's your mother's gift. By the time I finished the last letter, tears had blurred the ink. I pressed them to my chest and stayed like that for a long time, until the light through the attic window turned gold and the dust floated like gentle sparks. When I came downstairs, I didn't feel angry anymore. Just steady. The kind of steady that comes after storms. I met Matthew outside a few days later. He'd come to sign over his share officially. He looked tired, like a man aged not by years but by remorse. He handed me the keys. I've decided to leave town for a while, he said quietly. Start over somewhere new. I nodded. Maybe that's best. He looked at me for a long moment. You were right, you know. Dad wouldn't have wanted lies between us. For a heartbeat, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who built forts with me in the barn, who swore he'd always protect me. I reached out and took his hand. Then don't lie to yourself either. Learn from it. That's the only way any of us make peace. He nodded, tears glinting in his eyes. You forgive too easily, Ellie. I smiled faintly. No. I just don't like carrying poison. He laughed softly at that, the first time I'd heard him laugh in years. Then he turned, walked to his car, and drove away. When the sound of the engine faded, I stood there in the driveway alone, keys in hand, and realized something strange. I wasn't lonely. For the first time since I was a child, I felt like I was standing on ground that truly belonged to me. Not just the soil, not the walls, but the truth. That night, I slept in my father's room. The clock ticked again after I replaced the batteries, steady and rhythmic. I left the letters on his nightstand and whispered a quiet goodnight. The moonlight fell across the quilt he'd used for decades. It felt like being held. And in that stillness, I finally understood what he'd meant all along. Fairness isn't about winning or losing. It's about not letting anyone steal your name from. I moved back into the house at the start of spring. The air was softer, the trees just beginning to turn green again. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting the walls in gold. It felt strange, living in a place that had once felt stolen. Now it was mine again, but not because of the deed or the court's seal. It was mine because I had reclaimed the truth buried inside its walls. At first, the silence was too big. After years in the city, I wasn't used to hearing nothing but wind and birds. I'd find myself standing in doorways for long stretches, just listening. Sometimes I thought I could still hear my father's footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing from the back porch to the study. It wasn't haunting. It was grounding. The house needed work. The floors sagged, the roof leaked, and one of the upstairs windows was cracked. I could have hired help, but I wanted to fix it myself. I wanted my hands on every nail, every brushstroke. I wasn't just restoring the house, I was reclaiming myself. I started small. I sanded the banister, scrubbed the old tiles until the years of dust turned into a soft shine. I found his old tool chest, the same one he'd used to fix the tractor, and kept it open in the hall. Every hammer mark, every worn handle felt like a conversation. Neighbors began stopping by again. Some came with casseroles or flowers, others came with apologies. Most didn't know what to say. They'd believed the version of the story they were told, that I had been cut out for personal reasons. One afternoon, Mrs. Hargreaves, the widow who lived 2 farms over, stood on my porch with a basket of eggs. "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "He always said you had his fire. I just wish people had listened sooner." I thanked her and smiled. "Maybe it happened the way it needed to," I said. "Sometimes the truth takes the long road home." She nodded. "Ain't that the truth?" Word about the court ruling had spread far beyond our little town. The local paper even wrote a short piece about it, "Daughter Restores Family Legacy After Hidden Will Discovery." The headline felt too tidy for what had actually happened, but I clipped it anyway and pinned it on the fridge. It wasn't for pride, it was a reminder that even small voices can echo if they speak long enough. One day, as I was cleaning out the study, I found a half-finished notebook of my father's. He'd been keeping track of small expenses, the cost of feed, a note about the barn roof repair, and scribbles about a scholarship fund he'd been planning. On the last page, written faintly in pencil, were the words, "Help those who work hard but are forgotten." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It felt like an instruction. That night, I called Ruth. "Do you remember when you said I needed to do something good with this?" She laughed. "Yes. And I stand by it." "Why? What are you thinking?" "I found something Dad wrote. He wanted to help people who get left behind. I think I'm going to start a small foundation." "Something in his name? What kind of foundation?" "A scholarship," I said. "For girls from small towns. The kind of girls who grow up working harder than anyone sees." There was silence for a moment on the other end, then Ruth said, "That sounds like something he'd be proud of. And something you need." I smiled. "Maybe both." We spent the next few months building it. Ruth handled the outreach, I handled the finances and paperwork. We called it the Clarke Foundation for Fair Futures. The first time I said the name out loud, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, like a second heartbeat. The launch event was small, a handful of teachers, community members, and a few of my father's old friends. The town hall smelled of coffee and rain. I stood at the podium, nervous but steady. I once believed I'd lost everything my father wanted me to have, I began. But what I truly lost was my faith in fairness. This foundation isn't about money. It's about restoring what's right, not just for one person, but for anyone who's been told their name doesn't belong on the page. There was quiet in the room, the kind that means people are really listening. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. After the event, Matthew came up to me. I hadn't seen him since he left town. He looked healthier now, calmer. He offered a small smile. "You did it," he said. "You turned all that pain into something good." I studied his face, the familiar lines of guilt and grief softened by time. "It had to go somewhere," I said. "Might as well make it grow." He nodded, slipping an envelope into my hand. "I wanted to contribute," he said. "It's not much, but consider it a start." Inside was a check enough to fund 2 scholarships. My eyes stung. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "But I want to." We hugged, awkward, hesitant, but real. When he stepped back, there was relief in his eyes. Maybe that was forgiveness. Over time, the foundation grew. More people donated, stories spread, and each year we helped a few more young women go to school, build something of their own, step into a life that belonged fully to them. Sometimes, when I'd walk through the house at night, I'd stop in the study and whisper to the air, "We did it, Dad. We fixed what was broken." I didn't mean the inheritance anymore. I meant the silence. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun sink over the fields. The sky was streaked in orange and violet, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass. I realized I wasn't waiting for anything, not an apology, not approval, not even closure. I already had all of it. The truth had finally. A year passed quietly, though quiet meant something different now. It wasn't silence born of suppression, it was peace earned through truth. The Clarke Foundation had grown faster than I expected. What began as a single scholarship became a network of local women supporting each other, sharing their own stories of injustice, property disputes, and betrayal. Some days, I'd receive letters written in trembling handwriting from women in other towns. One read, "I thought I was the only one whose brothers took everything. But hearing your story gave me courage to go back to my lawyer. Thank you for showing me that fairness isn't weakness." Another said, "I lost my parents' land because I couldn't read the contract they made me sign. Now I'm learning business law at night school on your scholarship." Each letter felt like a small piece of healing, not just for them, but for me too. I started keeping them in a wooden box, the same green one where I'd found my father's letters in the attic. Every few weeks, I'd open it and read through them when the weight of memory got heavy again. It surprised me how purpose changes grief. I still missed him, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the smell of tobacco and rain on his coat, but the pain had softened into gratitude. He wasn't gone, he'd simply moved into the quiet corners of my courage. One late afternoon, as I was sorting through donation letters, the postman delivered a small brown envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, hesitant. I almost tossed it aside until I saw the return address. It was from Margaret, my mother's sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. Inside was a short letter and another envelope, older, sealed in brittle wax. Her note read, "Eleanor. I came across this while sorting old papers. It was left with me years ago, by your father. He asked that I give it to you if things between you and your brothers ever turned dark. I thought that time had passed, but I see now it didn't. Margaret." My hands trembled as I opened the second envelope. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "Ellie. If you're reading this, then the house has already caused pain, the very thing I wanted to prevent. I never meant for what I built to divide you. I knew your brothers were impatient, But I also knew your heart was steady. This house is not a prize, it's a responsibility. It carries the weight of every generation before us and every one that will come after. If they betray that trust, forgive them before it rots your own heart. You are the keeper of our name, Ellie. Not because of law or paper, but because you remember what it means to build something and keep it honest. Love always. Dad. I sat there for a long time, staring at the words. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known there would be deceit, and he'd left me not just a house or land, but direction. Forgive before it rots your heart. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the wind whistle through the trees outside the window. For months, I had thought justice was enough. But now, his words dug deeper. Was justice really peace without forgiveness? The next morning, I wrote to Matthew. It wasn't long, just a simple letter. Matthew. I wanted you to know that I found Dad's last letter. I think he wanted both of us to stop carrying what happened like a shield. I forgive you. I don't forget, but I forgive. Take care. Ellie. I didn't expect a reply. But 2 weeks later, an envelope came back. Inside was a single page written in his slow, careful handwriting. Ellie. I don't know how to thank you for that letter. I've been living with regret like a second skin. You were right, we painted over the cracks. I'm sorry. I hope one day, when people speak of Dad, they remember you as the one who kept him honest. Matt. I folded the letter and placed it in the same box as the others. Forgiveness doesn't erase history, it redeems it. As months passed, the house came alive again. I painted the kitchen walls pale cream, planted rosemary and lavender along the porch, and replaced the old broken fence out back. It was the same fence I'd fixed with him as a child, the one that started my first lesson in truth. And when I hammered in the last nail, I whispered, there. Cracks fixed right this time. One evening, I hosted a small gathering at the house, a reunion of sorts. Ruth came, some of the scholarship girls came too, even Clara, Robert's widow, showed up with her teenage daughter. The air was filled with the smell of baked bread, laughter, and soft music. Clara found me by the window, holding a cup of tea. You've turned this place into something beautiful again, she said. Maybe it always was, I replied. It just needed a little truth to shine through. She smiled. Robert would have wanted to see this. I nodded. Maybe he does. When everyone left, I stood on the porch alone, the night warm and quiet. Fireflies dotted the edge of the field, their lights flickering like tiny blessings. I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the trial, the anger, the healing. And I realized something I'd never said out loud. They hadn't just stolen an inheritance. They had stolen years of my belief that I was unloved. But the truth and my father had given it back. I sat down on the steps, breathing in the scent of lavender and rain, and whispered, it's yours again, Dad. And mine. By the time summer rolled in, the Clarke Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. What began as a tribute to my father had turned into something far larger, a movement that reached people I'd never met and likely never would. Letters arrived from women across the country, widows, daughters, mothers, all carrying their own versions of stolen trust. Some had been cut out of family estates, others tricked into signing away their homes. Each story echoed mine in a different voice, a different heartbreak. I used to think betrayal was something that only happened once, in one family. Now I understood it was a quiet epidemic, hidden behind politeness and paperwork. One morning, I received a phone call from a journalist in Richmond. She'd read about the foundation in a regional paper and wanted to feature my story. I think what you've done could help others speak up, she said. You've turned personal pain into public purpose, that's rare. Her words caught me off guard. I'd never thought of it that way. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. I was just trying to make sure my father's truth didn't die quietly. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. People began sending donations, lawyers reached out offering pro bono help for women in similar cases, and a small law firm even proposed a partnership to create a fair heirs program, free legal guidance for inheritance disputes. Every time I thought of Dad, I imagined him standing by the old fence, hands on his hips, watching me work, nodding in quiet approval. But with attention came questions, and not all of them kind. Some asked why I'd dragged my family through the mud. Others accused me of trying to profit from pity. At first, the criticism stung. But then I remembered what my father once said when I was young and we found a dead bird in the garden. I'd cried, thinking I'd done something wrong. He'd lifted my chin and said, "When you do what's right, Ellie, the noise will come." But noise isn't truth, it's fear of it. So I kept going. One afternoon, the mail brought a thick envelope stamped from the county archives. I'd requested my father's property records months ago but had forgotten about them. Inside were old deeds, tax receipts, and a single handwritten note folded between the pages. It wasn't part of the official file, it was personal. A message from the notary who had handled my father's affairs decades ago. "Dear Ms. Clarke, I thought you should know that your father once instructed me to create a second account under your mother's name, funds intended for a charitable purpose after his passing. The account was never claimed, as your brothers requested its closure after the estate dispute. Given recent developments, you have the legal right to access it. The remaining balance is substantial, with accrued interest. Please contact me if you wish to proceed. Harold L. Benton." I read it twice before I could even breathe properly. A second account. Hidden. Preserved all these years. That evening, I drove to the bank listed in the letter. The same brick building I'd walked past as a child, where Dad used to withdraw cash for payroll on Saturdays. The manager, a grey-haired man named Mr. Benton, the notary himself, greeted me with a slow, almost reverent smile. "You look just like your mother," he said. "Thomas always said she was the heart behind everything." He led me to a private office and handed me a folder. Inside was the account statement. The balance, even adjusted for inflation, was enough to fund the foundation for decades. "He set this up quietly," Mr. Benton said. "Said it was meant for something called the Clarke Fund for Honest Work. He said his daughter would know what to do with it when the time came." I pressed a hand to my chest. He trusted me. Even after everything. Mr. Benton nodded. "He knew who you were." When I drove home, the sun was setting behind the hills, a deep, steady orange that reminded me of the lamp that always burned in his study. I parked by the porch and just sat in the car, crying softly, not from grief this time, but from awe. That night, I walked out to the back porch, the air warm with the scent of summer grass. I spoke softly, as if he were still there beside me. "You planned this, didn't you?" I whispered. "You knew it would take me time. You knew I'd have to find the truth the long way." I laughed through tears. "You always did believe in teaching lessons the hard way." Inside, I placed the new documents beside the old will. The two pieces of his legacy, one about justice, the other about generosity, side by side. The next morning, I met with Ruth and told her everything. Her eyes widened as I spoke. "So, what will you do with it?" she asked. "Expand the foundation," I said. He left it for the same reason I built it, to make sure no one is erased quietly. Over the next few months, we established the Clarke Fund for Honest Work, a branch dedicated to helping women protect their legal rights in property and inheritance matters. Workshops, legal aid, community outreach, the kind of work my father would have done himself, had he lived long enough. The story made national news this time. I watched as my name appeared alongside his Thomas and Eleanor Clarke Foundation for Fair Futures. Seeing our names together like that felt like closure. Not legal closure, moral closure. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a women's conference in Atlanta. The hall was full, faces of every shade, age, and story. When I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight felt like sunlight through old farmhouse windows. I took a breath and began. When I was told I'd been disinherited, I thought my father had stopped loving me. I lived with that silence for 12 years. But one thing I've learned is this: silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it's waiting for the truth to find its voice. I found mine in an attic full of dust and lies. And if you've been told your truth doesn't matter, I want you to know it does. It always will. You just have to dig until you find it. When I finished, there was a long, heavy quiet, then a wave of applause that rolled like a tide. Afterward, a young woman came up to me in tears. My stepfather took my mother's will after she died, she said. I thought I'd never prove it. But you showed me I can. I hugged her, whispering, then start today. On the flight home, I watched the clouds drift below me and thought about Dad again. He'd built fences, raised barns, balanced ledgers, small things that lasted. But his greatest legacy wasn't in the house or the land. It was in the lesson he left me. Truth doesn't need defending, it needs carrying. When I got home that night, I found another letter waiting in the mailbox. This one was from Matthew. Ellie. I read about your speech. I'm proud of you. I visited Dad's grave today, I think he's proud too. I've decided to donate my share of the land to the foundation. It's the least I can do. Maybe now, we can finally rest. Matt. I sat down on the porch steps, letter trembling in my hand, and looked out over the fields. The moonlight stretched across the grass, soft and forgiving. Rest. That word carried more peace than I'd known in years. I whispered, we're home now, Dad. All of us. The night answered in quiet. The years after that blurred softly, like water running smooth over stone. Seasons came and went, each one leaving its small mark, the bloom of new wildflowers by the fence, the faint silver in my hair, the laughter of strangers who'd once been frightened girls now walking through my home as equals. The Clarke Foundation had become more than an organization. It was a living promise, a gathering of women who'd been silenced, cheated, or written out, now standing tall in their own right. They called themselves the Daughters of Clarke. The first time I heard it, I cried. Not from pride, but from something deeper, gratitude. Every month, a few of them would visit the farmhouse. We'd sit around the old wooden table, the same one where my father used to balance his ledgers, and share updates. There were success stories, land reclaimed, lawsuits won, families reconciled. And sometimes, there were failures too. But each woman carried herself with dignity, even in defeat. That was the real inheritance we'd built together. Ruth still came over most Sundays. Her laugh hadn't changed. She'd bring pie or coffee and tease me about how Eleanor Clarke had become some kind of legend. You realize, she said once, cutting into a peach tart, they're going to make a film about you one day. I laughed softly. If they do, I hope they get the dust right. She smiled. The dust? Yes, I said. The dust that floated in the attic when I found the will. That's what truth feels like. It's never shiny. It just lingers quietly until light touches it. We sat there for a while, the sound of the wind through the open window, the scent of warm peaches filling the room. When I turned 65, the board of the foundation insisted on honoring me with an award, something I didn't want but couldn't refuse. They called it the Keeper of Truth Award. At the ceremony, I stood at the podium once more, the lights softer this time, the room filled with faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew. Women who had fought their own battles, who had turned pain into power. I don't deserve this, I began, my voice steady but tender. Not alone. My father once told me that fairness isn't what you win, it's what you protect. I just carried what he built. The rest was all of you. After the applause faded, a young woman approached me, barely in her 20s, with bright, determined eyes. Miss Clarke, she said, voice trembling. I'm one of your scholarship girls. I'm graduating in law next year. I want to help women like you did. I smiled and took her hands in mine. Then you already have, I said. Her name was Leona. Over time, she became more than a student. She became my successor, the one I'd been waiting for without realizing it. When she first came to visit the farmhouse, she stopped in the doorway of my father's old study. It feels like he's still here, she whispered. He is, I said softly. His in every truth we tell. That summer, I asked her to take over as director of the foundation. She hesitated at first, afraid she wasn't ready. I told her readiness is just another word for courage practiced in silence. The night before she signed the papers, we sat on the porch under the same stars that had watched my father work late into the night. "Do you ever regret forgiving them?" she asked quietly. I thought for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over proof. You can't build anything new with your hands still clenched." She nodded, her eyes glinting in the porch light. "I hope I make you proud." "You already do," I said. When she drove away that night, the gravel crackled under her tires, the same sound I'd heard the day I'd first left that house, all those years ago. Only this time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like continuity. The next morning, I walked around the property, checking the fence line like Dad used to. The rosemary by the porch had grown thick and green. I plucked a sprig, rubbed it between my fingers, and breathed in its scent. It smelled of memory and renewal. In the distance, I saw Matthew walking up the path. His hair had gone white, his steps slower, but his eyes were softer now, the kind of softness that comes from surrender. "Thought I'd visit," he said. "The place looks alive again." "It should," I said, smiling. "It's finally been forgiven." We sat together on the porch, watching the sun climb over the fields. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You ever wonder if Dad planned all this?" I laughed. "Oh, I'm sure of it. He just left out the part about how long it would take." He smiled faintly. "I think he wanted to make sure we earned it." I nodded. "And I think we finally did." We stayed there until dusk, talking about small things, the harvest, the weather, the past. When he left, he hugged me longer than he ever had before. I watched him walk down the road until he disappeared behind the curve. That night, I wrote in my journal. Some truths are buried not to be hidden, but to be found at the right time. The will, the ledger, the house, they were all lessons disguised as loss. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the house settle around me. The wood sighed, the wind whispered through the open window, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to hold on to anything. The world would carry the story now through Leona, through the women still fighting, through every name written back onto a page that once erased it. As I drifted to sleep, I thought of my father's voice, steady and kind. "Fix the crack while you can still see it." And I smiled, knowing that this time, we truly had. The farmhouse is quiet now. The evenings come slower, softer, the kind that stretch out like deep breaths. The foundation runs without me these days, and that's how it should be. Leona sends letters, updates, photographs of the new offices and the women they help. Sometimes I recognize a face in those photos, a girl who once came here with tears, now smiling as she holds a certificate or a deed in her hands. I keep those photos in a small wooden box on my father's old desk. The same place I once found the will. The wood still smells faintly of tobacco and pine oil. Time changes everything, but not the scent of where truth first began. Some evenings, when the sun dips behind the fields, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and the wind in my hair. The world hums quietly around me, crickets, cicadas, the low rustle of grass. It feels like a conversation with the past. I think of my father, my brothers, even my mother, all of us bound by a story that could have ended in bitterness, but didn't. We found our way back to decency, one painful truth at a time. Sometimes, I think about that moment in the attic, the dust spinning in the sunlight, the quiet air heavy with revelation. If I close my eyes, I can still feel that first heartbeat of recognition, that my father hadn't forgotten me after all. That moment changed everything. You see, betrayal is loud when it happens, but healing, real healing, it whispers. It moves in silence. It builds slowly in the hands that keep showing up, day after day, even when no one is watching. People ask me what lesson I learned from all this. The truth is simple, and it's this. You can lose every tangible thing in your life, money, property, even people, and still win if you refuse to lose your sense of fairness. Fairness is what steadies your voice when the world tries to silence it. And forgiveness. Forgiveness is what lets you rest when the world has finally gone quiet. Before I go inside each night, I walk to the rosemary bush by the porch, the one planted in Margaret's memory. I brush my fingers across the leaves, feel their coolness, breathe in their scent. It smells sharp and clean, like memory washed in sunlight. I whisper, "Thank you," though I'm never sure who I'm saying it to anymore, my father, my brothers, maybe even myself. Then I look up at the stars, the same ones that once hung over a frightened girl standing in a dusty attic, holding a will that changed everything, and I smile. Because I know now what home truly is. It isn't the land. It isn't the inheritance. It's the place inside you that still chooses honesty, even after the world tried to take it away. Would you have done what I did? Would you have dug up the truth, even if it meant losing almost everything? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear your story too. And if this story reminded you of someone who deserves to be remembered, share it.